In this video, we invite you to step into a world where beer was a common breakfast beverage. Opium appeared in recipe books, and flying ointments could serve as both remedies and instruments of the devil. We will explore daily life, medicine, and religion, touching on taboos and punishments, as well as celebrations and visions. Gradually, we will reveal how deeply intertwined the medieval person was with various substances, teetering between divine connection and the brink of despair. So, lean back, get comfortable in your bed, and join me on a journey into the Middle Ages. Chapter 1. A Life in Intoxication, exploring why beer was considered safer than water. Imagine waking up on a crisp morning in the 13th century. Before you lies not a steaming cup of coffee nor a glass of fresh water, but rather a clay jug filled with beer. To us, this may seem peculiar, yet for the people of that era, it was entirely normal. Clear water was deemed unsafe. Water drawn from wells could taste foul, while that from streams was often murky and fraught with danger. Drinking such water risked stomach pains, fevers, and in the worst case, deadly diseases. In contrast, beer offered a sense of safety, as the brewing process involved heating the water, and although the alcohol content was low, it effectively killed many germs. Thus, the day in the Middle Ages did not commence in sobriety, but rather with a light buzz. The beer consumed daily was vastly different from what we know today in bottles or mugs. It was weak, thin, and had a low alcohol content, often referred to as small beer. This particular variety was so mild that even children could partake in its consumption. It quenched thirst, provided a sense of fullness, and was considered easily digestible. Brewing beer was a common practice in nearly every household, and in many villages, small brewing kettles were as commonplace as a stove in a modern kitchen. With this beverage, people lived with a sense of security, even though they understood that alcohol could weaken the body. Those who drank too much risked staggering or losing their strength. However, for those without access to beer, the risk of infection from drinking water was a real threat. Beyond the light beer, there were also stronger drinks that had a noticeable effect and were not intended for everyday consumption. Mead, the sweet honey wine, was among these special beverages. It was considerably more potent than the daily beer and was regarded as a noble drink. Wine also played a significant role, especially in the warmer regions of Europe where viticulture had been established since antiquity. Wine was a beverage reserved for festive occasions, religious ceremonies, and for those who could afford it. In monasteries, it served a liturgical purpose, symbolizing the blood of Christ during the Eucharist. Thus, the everyday drinker typically opted for the weaker beer. Yet, during celebrations such as weddings or market days, mead and wine were essential components of the festivities. Monasteries played a particularly vital role in this context. Monasteries possessed the essential knowledge required to produce beer and wine not only on a large scale but also with consistent quality. Monks were often the true guardians and refiners of brewing techniques. They developed methods that enhanced flavor and extended shelf life. While in ordinary homes the brew would spoil quickly, often taking on the unpleasant tastes of burnt wood, ash, or musty herbs, the beers produced in monasteries could be stored for longer periods and even traded. Many modern breweries trace their roots back to these monastic traditions. However, it was not just the alcohol itself that created intoxication, it was also what was added to it. Herbs and spices could alter both aroma and effects. Before hops became the dominant ingredient in the late Middle Ages, a variety of plants were used to give beer both flavor and preservation qualities. Juniper berries, roots, leaves from forest plants, and even spicy herbs found their way into the brew. Some of these additives not only had a preservative or flavoring effect, but also produced intoxicating effects. Drinking beer infused with henbane or similar herbs could lead to a stronger, sometimes confusing intoxication. This led to a remarkable diversity of beverages that varied significantly from region to region. The constant availability of beer and wine did not mean that consumption was without limits. Rulers, towns, and sometimes even landowners established regulations regarding when brewing could take place and in what quantities. On one hand, they wanted to ensure that there was enough grain left for bread production. On the other hand, they sought to prevent community members from drinking excessively and becoming incapacitated. Craft guilds also attempted to impose order in the taverns. Tavern keepers were not allowed to sell punch and brew indiscriminately. There were regulations concerning prices and at times even the size of the mugs served. This illustrates that alcohol was not merely a habit but a powerful force that influenced the social and economic fabric of a community. When all these factors are considered together, it becomes clear. Beer was not a luxury in the Middle Ages. It was a staple food, standing alongside bread, porridge, and soup. Without beer, a village might not have survived its daily challenges. The mugs provided not only thirst relief but also a sense of security. Even though it was known that alcohol could weaken the body, it was still safer than the water that could be contaminated. Thus, daily intoxication was not primarily about pleasure but about survival. Yet, alcohol took on many forms. It was a festive adornment at weddings, a bonding element in taverns, an offering in religious services, and at the same time, a source of rules and prohibitions. Beer, mead, and wine were prevalent in medieval society, yet they always had to be maintained in a delicate balance between provision and abuse, between safety and vulnerability. However, a mere glance beyond the taverns reveals that what was brewed in the jug was only a part of the medieval substances. The true magic often resided in the unassuming plants found in meadows and gardens, in herbs whose powers promised healing and transcendence. Chapter 2: The Secret Gardens. Herbs between healing and intoxication. An inconspicuous herb at the marketplace could unleash healing powers or trigger a dangerous trance. As one wandered through the squares of a medieval town, alongside bread, meat, and textiles, one would also find small bundles of dried plants. For many, these herbs were as commonplace as salt or grain. Yet, each of these herbs carried significance that extended far beyond merely enhancing the flavor of food. Some alleviated toothaches or helped combat fevers, while others promised to lighten the heart or ward off evil spirits. Conversely, certain herbs, if misused, could intensify pain, provoke hallucinations, and even lead to death. One such example was the herb known as henbane. The dark seeds and sticky leaves of this plant had been utilized since antiquity. In small quantities, it could be brewed into a concoction that dulled pain. Those suffering from severe toothaches or restless sleep found brief relief in a tea or tincture made from it. However, this same plant also possessed a darker side. Just a few seeds too many could induce dizziness, cramps, or visions. Thus, henbane was regarded as a delicate herb, beneficial, yet always approached with caution. Even more mysterious was the mandrake. It was not only mentioned in recipes but also woven into myths and stories. The root grew deep in the earth, branching out thickly and sometimes resembling a small human figure. For many, it was more than just a plant. It appeared as a being imbued with its own power. Healers carved figures from the roots, wrapped them in cloth, or immersed them in oil to enhance their effects. The mandrake was believed to promote fertility, soothe pain, or induce sleep. Yet it was also feared. According to legend, those who dug up the root would hear a deadly scream. Anyone who was not cautious enough might succumb to this sound. Such tales lent the plant an aura of both the forbidden and the sacred. The applications of these herbs were diverse. They were dried and steeped in hot water, brewed into teas, or mixed with wine. In salves and ointments, the plants were combined with fat or oil. When applied to the skin, they could provide warmth or numbness. Some individuals even carried the herbs with them in small linen pouches, seeking protection from pain and the malevolent gaze of others. Even within households that possessed little knowledge about medicinal remedies, simple recipes could be found. There were concoctions for alleviating stomach aches, wraps for sprains, and potions for persistent fevers. This knowledge was concentrated in the hands of certain individuals. Midwives were familiar with plants that could ease childbirth or induce labor. They shared their knowledge with other women, sometimes in secrecy, and at other times openly. Healers who sold notable herbs understood the safe dosages and the appropriate duration for steeping a remedy. Monks, in their monasteries, meticulously recorded recipes in manuscripts, noting which plants should be harvested in each month. Although this knowledge was invaluable, it was also perilous. A miscalculated dosage could cost a life. The line between medicine and poison was razor thin. An herb that provided relief in small amounts could induce hallucinations in larger quantities. There were accounts of individuals who, after consuming certain mixtures, fell into a trance, heard voices, or saw colors that did not exist in reality. These experiences were interpreted by some as divine visions, while others viewed them as the work of the devil. Healers, familiar with such states, cautioned their apprentices and insisted on exercising caution. Particularly captivating was the mandrake, known scientifically as Mandragora officinarum. This plant was sought after for its anesthetic properties, which were useful during surgeries and for alleviating severe pain. At the same time, it was infamous for its toxicity, which could weaken the heart. Folklore suggested that the root only grows in places where blood has been shed, and anyone who pulls it out too quickly risks their life. Therefore, it was said that one must have a dog pull it from the earth with a rope to avoid death. Such stories reflect the fascination and fear that this plant could evoke in equal measure. At the heart of these narratives was a profound truth. The effects of substances often depended on the quantity consumed. Early scholars recognized that any substance could serve as both a remedy and a poison. A weak infusion could provide calm, while a strong potion could lead to poisoning. This understanding shaped humanity's relationship with plants. They were not seen as purely adversarial, nor as entirely trustworthy allies. Rather, it was the role of the knowledgeable individual to draw the right boundary, to strengthen the body without destroying it. Thus, the Garden of the Middle Ages was a place of contrasts. Here, simple culinary herbs like parsley and thyme grew alongside powerful plants like wolfsbane, which was so toxic that even its leaves could cause burns. Spices that made food more palatable coexisted with flowers that could cloud the mind. For the uninitiated, this was a hazardous environment, yet for the enlightened, it was a realm of knowledge and hope. Some of these herbs were visibly present in everyday life, appearing as small bundles at a market stall or as dried clusters hanging above the hearth. Others, however, required searching for, as they grew deep in the forest or on solitary fields where not everyone was permitted to tread. It was precisely these hidden gifts of nature that gave individuals the sensation of touching a secret of the natural world. From these concealed treasures, the paths led further to mushrooms and roots that unleashed even stronger, more foreign effects. Chapter 3. From Forest Spirits to Visionary Brews, Mushrooms and Mixtures. A singular mushroom could transform the mundane into an extraordinary world. In the Middle Ages, those who gathered fly agarics, ergot mushrooms, or other unusual fungi often did not fully comprehend the effects that would follow. For many, mushroom foraging in the woods was a necessity, as these fungi were considered food, spices, or ingredients in soups. Yet, every so often, consumption would lead to experiences that transcended mere satiety. Suddenly, individuals would perceive patterns in the sky, hear voices, or feel a sense of lightness. Such experiences could be interpreted as visions. Many cultures around the world recognized the power of mushrooms, roots, and mysterious mixtures. In Asia, for instance, Daoist texts spoke of mushrooms believed to confer immortality. There, the mushroom was not merely a plant but a bridge between humanity and the cosmos. In the Americas, roots such as the peyote cactus or ayahuasca mixtures were known. Shamans employed these substances in rituals to access the spirit world. Europe was not isolated from this knowledge. Here, too, tales circulated of drinks that induced dreams or ointments that altered consciousness. For some, such altered states were seen as gifts. Those who fell into trances and heard voices could find answers to questions that remained hidden in ordinary life. The visions were interpreted as divine signs. Conversely, others perceived danger in these experiences. Hallucinations could easily be understood as manifestations of the devil. A farmer wandering confusedly through the village, calling out incoherent things, could be regarded both as a visionary and as someone unwell. The line between these interpretations was blurred and depended heavily on the context in which the experience occurred. Particularly mushrooms held this dual role. The fly agaric, with its vibrant red cap, could induce intoxication in small amounts. Some northern groups likely used it to bolster their courage in battle. However, it could just as easily cause nausea and cramps. The ergot fungus, which grew on rye, could destabilize entire villages when it contaminated bread. People complained of pains, saw fiery trails, and experienced convulsions that were interpreted as either religious ecstasy or demonic dances. Today, we recognize this phenomenon as ergotism. Yet at that time, the interpretation of such occurrences was ambiguous, oscillating between wonder and punishment. Not only individual plants played a role, mixtures also contributed significantly to these complex experiences. Those who had access to various herbs were able to create pastes or drinks whose effects were often unpredictable. A mixture of wine, certain herbs, and honey could be intoxicating and open the mind to new experiences. Some pastes, when blended with fats and applied to the skin, induced feelings of warmth or even the sensation of flying. These concoctions appeared in tales as flying ointments. People believed that by using them, they could transcend into foreign realms, perhaps drawing near to angels or entering the company of witches. The crafting of such substances was not restricted to any particular social class. Monks experimented in secrecy, mixing herbs and meticulously recording their effects. Midwives were familiar with salves that could alleviate pain during childbirth. Peasant women knew how to dry plants to prepare invigorating brews. Behind each recipe lay experience, often gained through arduous trials, whether by careful observation or through unfortunate mistakes. Whether a substance was deemed good or evil was never definitively clear. The same plant could serve as a remedy when consumed in moderation, yet become a poison when taken in excess, or even act as a portal to another world when combined with specific ingredients. Thus, these substances were shrouded in an air of mystique. Their use always carried an element of risk. Those who dared to partake could experience divine proximity, but could also invoke the wrath of their community. Rituals only intensified this perception. In shamanic ceremonies, whether in Asia or the Americas, it was the leader's role to guide the intoxication. Music, drumming, and chanting accompanied these altered states, imbuing the visions with meaning. Then, in Europe, there were also forms of communal experience. Herbal brews were shared at gatherings, and those who partook could enter a shared trance. Dreams were then interpreted, and stories of nature spirits were recounted. For some, this was a means of harmonizing with the forces of nature, while for others, it was merely dangerous sorcery. Surprisingly, Europe was not isolated in its practices. Trade routes brought not only silk and spices, but also knowledge about intoxicating substances. Crusaders encountered mixtures in the Near East that they had never known back home. Arabic writings describe substances that altered the mind and body, and these texts gradually found their way into Latin translations. In this manner, European intoxication became part of a global network of experiences, tales, and recipes. Thus, during the Middle Ages, people discovered that a single mixture could evoke both divine visions and demonic fears. The same substances that signified healing for some could lead others into illness or despair. This ambiguity accompanied every application, making it profoundly influential in the culture of that era. This fine line was especially evident not only in the woods and marketplaces, but also within the realm of healing practices, in those places where doctors, monks, and healers made decisions about life and death. Intoxication played an even more significant role. Chapter 4. The Art of Healers. When opium alleviated pain. In dimly lit hospital rooms, where light filtered through only a small candle, patients sometimes experienced a bittersweet relief from the sleep that opium provided. When pain became unbearable, when a wound refused to heal, or when surgery was imminent, healers knew that a remedy derived from the dried milk sap capsules of the poppy promised relief. Long before the Middle Ages, opium was already known. Through the writings of Islamic physicians, who preserved and advanced the knowledge of ancient scholars, it increasingly found its way into European medical texts. Thus, a substance that had long been widespread in eastern regions also established its place in the monasteries and medical practices of the West. The effects of opium were reliable. Those who consumed it experienced a dampening of their pain, a tranquility that in times of severe illness seemed almost like a blessing. Burning wounds, throbbing bones, and fevers that rendered limbs immobile faded into the background. Some patients were able to sleep at least, while others regained strength for the days ahead. However, this relief was not without its shadows, for those treated with opium for extended periods felt not only calm but also dependence. The body craved more, and the initial healing transformed into a profound necessity. Doctors and pharmacists sought ways to harness the effects of opium without causing harm to the patient. One of the most well-known results was laudanum, a mixture of wine, herbs, and opium. It was consumed to combat pain and insomnia. The precise composition varied, yet the fundamental idea remained the same. The aim was to tame the numbing power by combining it with other substances. The hope was that the wine would moderate the effect, the herbs would support the body, and the opium content would be just sufficient to alleviate suffering without destroying the patient. This knowledge was not solely in the hands of learned physicians. Monks in monasteries also possessed recipe books containing records of the correct dosages. They preserved this knowledge in libraries, copying it and passing it on to the next generation. Midwives employed similar methods when assisting women during difficult childbirths. Although their expertise was often not officially recognized, they were well aware of the plants that could soothe fear and pain. In certain regions, they guarded small supplies of opium or mixtures, as need was a common aspect of daily life. Meanwhile, urban doctors experimented with variations, mixing opium with honey or vinegar, thus producing their own recipes. Particularly in the late Middle Ages, a notable figure emerged who became renowned for his experiments with various substances. Paracelsus, a physician of the early modern period, drew upon ancient knowledge and melded it with his own observations. For him, it was evident that no substance was inherently good or bad. The crucial factor was the correct dosage, the amount that defined moderation and limits. In his experiments, he combined opium with other ingredients and explored ways to precisely control its effects. Although many of his ideas were initially met with skepticism by his contemporaries, they profoundly influenced the perception of medicine as something that constantly oscillated between healing and danger. However, long before Paracelsus, physicians had already recognized the necessity for caution. Some wrote warnings in their works, cautioning that excessive opium could permanently weaken both consciousness and the body. Patients undergoing prolonged treatment could become lethargic, lose their memory, or find themselves unable to navigate daily life without the substance. There are accounts of individuals for whom opium was initially a source of relief, yet they soon found themselves only able to function when they had access to it. This presented a dilemma for doctors. They needed to alleviate pain, but were acutely aware that frequent doses could create a new state of illness. In monasteries, this knowledge held significant importance. There, where healing was intertwined with faith, opium was viewed both as a gift of nature and as a potentially dangerous remedy. Monks caring for the sick faced the challenging decision of whether to administer the substance. Some sought to limit its use to the utmost, while others applied it more liberally. The boundary between these approaches was often fluid, with pragmatic considerations frequently dictating its application. A screaming patient could be soothed. A dying individual could depart this world in peace. Moreover, traces of opium's use in the everyday lives of common people have been preserved. Merchants reported on small quantities traded in markets, often expensive and accessible only to those who could afford them. For impoverished farmers, access remained limited. They were more familiar with the herbs of the fields than with this potent drug. Nevertheless, the reputation of opium was so formidable that it appeared in stories and folklore as a miraculous potion, something capable of bringing the body into a profound tranquility unlike any other remedy. However, experience repeatedly demonstrated how swiftly healing could transform into dependency. A wounded knight treated with opium tinctures might survive, yet remain unable to live without the substance afterward. Similarly, an urban patient suffering from toothaches who received small doses daily soon developed a craving for the numbness, demanding more within just a few months. Such examples led healers to approach these substances with even greater respect. Thus, one could say that even in the Middle Ages, physicians understood that every treatment exacted a price. The price of healing could manifest as recovery, yet it could also lead to dependency, weakness, or a lingering haze in the mind. Each alleviation was a delicate balancing act, a struggle between necessity and danger. This made the practice of healing not only a field of hope, but also a realm where the weight of decisions pressed heavily upon the shoulders of healers. However, this tension was not confined to the sick rooms alone. In churches, monasteries, and sacred spaces, intoxication played a significant role as well. In Chapter 5, titled "Between Incense and Dream Flights, Ecstasy in Faith," we delve into how even a hint of smoke could open hearts or seduce souls. Upon entering a medieval service, one would immediately smell the rich fragrances of incense and myrrh that filled the air. The burning of hearts was an integral part of Christian ceremonies. The smoke was intended to carry prayers upward while simultaneously soothing the senses. For the faithful, this transcendence into another realm was a sign of closeness to God. Often, they felt a gentle dizziness in the soft haze, interpreted as a form of devotion. Yet, in the eyes of some church fathers, this experience could also be seen as a deception. Was this gentle trance truly a heavenly gift, or merely a byproduct of the substances dispersed in the air? Incense and myrrh were precious commodities, arriving in Europe through extensive trade routes, often from Arab and African regions. In churches, these substances were used sparingly, yet the smoke played a visible role. Priests would swing the incense burner, and the faithful would bow, creating an atmosphere of mystery and weightlessness in the mist. One can imagine that the common person, who was accustomed only to the smoke of wood fires, perceived something otherworldly in this experience. The scent, intertwined with hymns and the ringing of bells, opened the mind to thoughts that transcended the ordinary. Some experienced this as a sacred proximity, while others feared that such a state of dizziness might grant the devil easier access. While in Christianity, smoke and heartfelt expressions were integral to rituals, in the Islamic cultural sphere, different practices of ecstasy emerged. Sufis, for instance, utilized hashish to temporarily dissolve the ego. The goal was not mere enjoyment, but rather a fleeting closeness to God. This experience served to subordinate the self and to sense the divine will. Some schools of thought tolerated or even encouraged these practices, while others vehemently opposed them, viewing intoxicating substances as a threat to pure devotion. This illustrates that ecstasy was not solely a matter of chemistry, but also a question of interpreting religious rules. In contrast to this more open approach, the prevailing views in Christian Europe remained firmly attached to the visible smoke and the symbolic effects of scents. Incense symbolized purification, while myrrh represented holiness. Herbs such as rosemary and thyme appeared in smaller rituals, such as blessing spaces or driving away evil spirits. Pilgrims undertaking long journeys carried bundles of dried plants with them, seeking protection during their travels. It was not just about the fragrance. The belief was that these plants contained an invisible power that made the path safer. However, there were also rituals performed outside official settings where a different kind of ecstasy played a significant role. Accounts mention so-called flying ointments, which were concoctions made from various plants, including nightshades like deadly nightshade and henbane. When mixed with fat and applied to the skin, these ointments could induce a sensation of floating. For those who used them, it felt as if they could fly or journey through the air. They might have merely sat by a fire, yet their senses deceived them into believing they were soaring through the atmosphere. From these experiences emerged the image of the witch riding through the night on a broomstick. These mixtures had a medicinal core, as the same plants could alleviate pain or assist with skin ailments. However, their effects were challenging to control. Even a small overdose could lead to hallucinations, which were often recounted in vivid detail. Those who experienced these effects sometimes spoke of encounters with supernatural beings or gatherings in the woods, which, from a contemporary perspective, could be seen as part of an intense altered state of consciousness. In that era, however, such experiences were frequently interpreted as encounters with dark forces. This misinterpretation led to the development of witch trials. When individuals claimed to have traveled through the air at night, the church viewed this as evidence of pacts with the devil. An ointment, once a simple aid, could suddenly be seen as a sign of demonic activity. For healers who worked with these recipes, this presented a significant danger. Merely possessing certain herbs could be enough to arouse suspicion. Those in a village who exhibited unusual knowledge risked accusations of witchcraft. In trials, references to flying ointments often served as accusations, even when no one knew precisely how the mixture was created. At the heart of the issue was the intertwining of religious visions and chemical effects. Those who felt tears during a church service and saw a glow in the haze of incense might interpret this as a divine touch. Conversely, someone who fell into a trance while foraging for an ointment in the woods might believe they had glimpsed the powers of the night. In both instances, the experience was real for the individual, even if its origins lay in vapors, herbs, or toxins. The people of that time did not distinguish between the effects of a substance and the revelation of the divine. Both were seen as one and the same, equally valid in their own right. This ambiguity allowed for a wide range of interpretations. A believer who felt the presence of God after a sermon could not definitively say whether it was the incense they inhaled or a divine grace that enveloped them. Similarly, a woman who spoke of visions after applying a salve could be regarded as a patient, a visionary, or, disturbingly, as a witch. Such experiences bore both heavenly and diabolical qualities simultaneously. The question of whether intoxication brought one closer to God or served as a perilous temptation remained unresolved. For some, it was a gateway to the soul, while for others it represented a snare set by the devil. Thus, people lived within this tension, shaped equally by faith and fear. In sacred spaces where certain forms of intoxication were tolerated, secular authorities often intervened with strict measures. There, regulations, punishments, and threats awaited to prevent any form of excess. In this context, the chapter titled Of Pleasure and Punishment, the Taboos of Intoxication, reveals that a simple herb could either provide relief or lead one to the edge of a pyre. For the people of the time, it was never clear whether a plant, a drink, or a salve was to be considered a remedy, a harmless aid, or the work of the devil. This uncertainty fostered an environment where intoxication not only had psychological and physical effects, but also social implications. It could determine one's reputation, freedom, or downfall. In certain regions, the use of specific substances was remarkably commonplace. Historical records indicate that hemp was extensively cultivated in some areas for its fibers, which were used to make ropes, clothing, and paper. However, it was also consumed in small amounts, either smoked or incorporated into food. For many, this felt like a mild, relaxing aid, perhaps as ordinary as a glass of wine. In some cities, there was nothing objectionable about this practice. Hemp was simply part of daily life. Yet, just a few days' travel away, the situation could be starkly different. Some city administrations imposed strict bans on the consumption of cannabis or similar substances. Those caught in violation faced public punishments, which could range from flogging to imprisonment. Women who mixed herbal potions to treat the sick were particularly vulnerable to suspicion. Their activities were often quickly reinterpreted from healing arts to witchcraft. Thus, what was celebrated as assistance in one village could lead to dire consequences for the same women in another. The church played a pivotal role in this matter. For clergy, the focus was less on the substance itself and more on the intention behind its use. When incense filled a space during a worship service, it was deemed pleasing to God. However, if a herb produced a similar intoxicating effect outside of the altar's sanctity, the immediate question arose, was the devil at work here? Priests warned that the devil would not appear with glaring horns, but rather would subtly infiltrate through indulgences and sensory illusions. For this reason, anything that confused the mind was viewed with suspicion. Furthermore, women who possessed knowledge of certain herbs were often perceived as a threat. A midwife, skilled in the use of labor-inducing plants, could save lives in dire situations. However, the very same plants, when misused, had the potential to cause miscarriages or trigger hallucinations. When such unfortunate events occurred, the path to an accusation of witchcraft was alarmingly short. Instead of being seen as a helper, the woman was branded as a servant of evil. Particularly at night, when ailments worsened and the lines between healing and harmful magic blurred, distrust ran high. Not only individuals but entire groups could fall under suspicion. Anyone who stood out at festivities for speaking incoherently after consuming unusual herbs or describing visions could easily be regarded as a heretic. In the medieval context, heresy did not merely refer to false teachings. It encompassed any experience that deviated from the official doctrine of the Church. If someone claimed to have conversed with angels in a dream, bystanders might interpret this as piety. However, if the individual spoke of colorful figures lifting them to the heavens, demonic influences were quickly suspected. In this context, the so-called flying ointments became particularly dangerous. Reports of women applying such mixtures and then recounting experiences of nocturnal journeys were frequently presented as evidence of witchcraft during trials. Whether these ointments genuinely induced feelings of levitation or were merely myths was of little concern to the courts. What mattered was that the notion of witches flying at night aligned perfectly with the Church's antagonistic narrative. Thus, any ointment containing specific herbs, regardless of whether they were medicinal or benign, became a potential risk for its users. Consequently, many individuals unknowingly walked a precarious line. They turned to healing plants to alleviate pain, entirely unaware that the same herbs could place them in jeopardy. It was not always clear where the boundary lay between a sacred plant and a devilish poison. The determination of this boundary rested not in the hands of the sick or the healer, but rather in the interpretations of the community and its authorities. If a patient recovered, it was attributed to divine assistance. Conversely, if the patient perished, the same treatment was labeled as witchcraft. This pervasive uncertainty fostered an atmosphere of fear and caution. Many preferred to remain silent about their experiences with intoxicants, even if they had found relief. Others sought to keep their knowledge strictly confidential to avoid suspicion. Particularly in rural areas, recipes circulated in whispers. The right herb for a cough, a potion to combat insomnia, a remedy to quell anxiety, yet speaking openly about such matters could lead to social ruin. For the secular authorities, the management of intoxicants was also a matter of societal order. Rulers and city councils feared that excessive consumption could impair the productivity of their subjects. Thus, punishment and morality became intertwined. Officially, any amount of intoxicating substances that led to debauchery or laziness was condemned. However, unofficially, everyone knew that beer or wine was virtually indispensable. This created a contradictory stance. A staple food was tolerated, while other substances were harshly pursued. Every intoxication, therefore, was more than just a personal experience. It posed the risk of crossing a line. Was the state at the end divine blessing or diabolical ruin? No one could answer that question with certainty. For the individual, there remained only the risk that their actions could be deemed transgressive. The transition from remedy to heresy was often a mere step away. And yet, despite punishments, threats, and fear, intoxication remained deeply rooted in society. One could find it at celebrations, weddings, in taverns, and in marketplaces. It was an inseparable part of life, even if it was taboo, particularly where community was celebrated. Reaching for a jug or familiar drink was commonplace. This illustrates that the desire for escapism was stronger than any prohibitions, and intoxication remained a part of joy and the bonds between people. Chapter 7, Community in the Cup, Celebrations and Customs. No wedding, no funeral was complete without a jug of beer. For the people of the Middle Ages, alcohol was not merely a beverage, it was an integral part of all significant life transitions. Whether celebrating or mourning birth, marriage, or death, the clinking of mugs and the pouring of ale were essential. Drinking held a different significance back then compared to today, as alcohol not only induced intoxication but also visibly manifested community. Those with something to celebrate shared drinks. Those bidding farewell drank to preserve memories. Even the poorest expected a sip on special occasions, as without it, the celebration was deemed incomplete. In taverns, daily social life unfolded. They served as meeting points for merchants, craftsmen, and travelers. Over beer or wine, people exchanged news, established business contacts, or simply forged friendships. Especially in cities, the tavern thrived, and one could say that a portion of urban politics was negotiated at the long tables with jugs in hand. Markets were also associated with drinking. Merchants were offered cups as a sign of trust. Business deals were sealed with a shared drink. Alcohol held significant economic value in medieval society as it fostered trust and strengthened social bonds. Family rituals were closely intertwined with drinking customs. For instance, during childbirth, a special drink known as the mother's milk drink was prepared. This unique brew, typically made from beer mixed with honey or herbs, was offered to guests to celebrate the health of the newborn. Everyone who participated in this ritual connected the act of drinking with the child being welcomed into the community. At weddings, there existed a tradition involving the groom's special beer, known as al. This particular beer was often crafted by the bride's family. Guests would partake in this brew, paying symbolic amounts, thereby contributing to the wedding expenses. In this way, the wedding beer served not only as a source of enjoyment, but also played a vital economic role in helping to establish a young family. However, these celebrations did not always promote harmony. The more alcohol that was consumed, the more likely disputes arose. Chronicles from the time recount brawls at weddings, fights following funerals, and disturbances in taverns. A feast could quickly transform from a celebration of community into a source of discord within a few short hours. As a response to this, rulers and city councils sometimes attempted to regulate the extent and timing of these festivities. They set limits on tavern hours and established prices for beer and wine. Yet, experience often revealed that the thirst of the people was stronger than any regulations imposed. Monasteries played a crucial role in providing safe beverages. They brewed beer on a larger scale, often producing stronger and more durable varieties than the home-brewed beer found in local households. When significant celebrations approached, monasteries would deliver entire barrels. This was as important for religious holidays as it was for village feasts. Wine also occasionally came from monastic estates. Thus, monks became invisible contributors to the festive culture in both rural and urban settings. It can be said that without the monasteries, the drinking culture of the Middle Ages would have been significantly impoverished, and many celebrations might not have occurred to the same extent. A particularly noteworthy aspect was the mourning feasts. When a person died, the village gathered not only for the burial but also to drink together. Following the religious rites, meals were served where beer was poured. It was believed that the drink should accompany the soul of the deceased and provide comfort to the community. Similarly, when orphan children were taken into new families or a community member set out on a journey, these transitions were also celebrated with beer. People associated the act of drinking from a jug with entering a new chapter in life. Thus, beer became a part of an unwritten ritual book of the community. Through such customs, alcohol was no longer merely seen as a means of intoxication, but rather as an integral part of a shared language understood by all. Raising a mug signifies, "I belong here," passing it along conveys, "You are part of this community." Even those who could not drink much would take at least a sip to affirm their connection with others. It was less about individual intoxication and more about the collective act of drinking that formed the essence of this social ritual. However, the dual nature of this culture was evident. On one hand, it fostered a sense of belonging. On the other hand, it could lead to excesses. Reports of farmers who were incapacitated for days after festivities aligned with sermons that condemned overindulgence. Priests warned that while the cup fosters community, it can also weaken the soul. Nonetheless, abstaining from drinking was not an option for many, as no one wanted to miss out on participation. When viewed collectively, these customs revealed that alcohol was far more than just a liquid in a jug. It served as a social bond that united families and villages, an economic tool that financed weddings, and a source of comfort during times of mourning. This bond was so strong that even recurring conflicts could not destroy it. It lived on in traditions, making intoxication a part of the collective order. Drinking culture was thus as festive as it was economically significant. When one discusses the Middle Ages, it is not merely about battles or cathedrals. It also encompasses the mugs in people's hands, the songs sung in taverns, and the customs observed at tables and graves. Alcohol wove through life like a red thread, transforming even mundane actions into significant gestures of community. Yet, as ingrained as this intoxication was within the societal fabric, it had the potential to destabilize entire regions. The transition from sacred community to destructive excess was smaller than one might have imagined at the time. Sometimes just a loaf of bread or a single cup could plunge an entire population into fear. In the chapter titled "When Healing Turns to Ruin, Dangers and Abuse," we learn that contaminated bread could send a town into a frenzy of dancing. In the Middle Ages, when grain was infested with a specific fungus known as ergot, it was often unwittingly ground into flour. From this flour, bread was baked that appeared innocuous but posed a lethal threat. Those who consumed it could develop symptoms ranging from burning pains in their arms and legs to hallucinations and convulsions. People referred to these afflictions as Saint Anthony's fire, named after the saint whose brotherhoods tended to such afflicted individuals. Today, we recognize this condition as ergotism. However, for the people of the Middle Ages, it was shrouded in mystery. Shout Dawit. Some believed it to be divine punishment, while others attributed it to demonic forces at play. St. Anthony's fire could strike entire communities. Imagine a village where nearly everyone had consumed the same bread. Soon, piercing cries of agony echoed across the fields. The afflicted complained of sensations of heat, as if their limbs were on fire. Hands would curl into tight fists, and legs would seize up in painful cramps. Some individuals fell into trance-like states, laughing or weeping uncontrollably. Others wandered through the streets as if they were following an invisible melody, a phenomenon later chronicled as a form of dance mania. Tragically, some suffered from necrosis, resulting in the loss of fingers or even entire limbs. For observers at the time, such occurrences were bewildering and difficult to interpret. While we can now identify toxins in grain, they suspected curses or the malevolent influence of the devil. Many sought help from the Antonite brotherhoods, religious communities that established hospitals, particularly in France and southern Germany, where St. Anthony's fire was more prevalent. There, the sick were treated with herbs, specific diets, and prayers. Bread made from pilgrimage offerings, which was free from ergot, proved to be healing simply because it avoided contaminated grain. The Antonites became renowned for the relief that patients experienced after their stay, which was seen by the afflicted as a testament to the power of St. Anthony. Today, we understand that it was merely the absence of tainted grain that provided this improvement. Nevertheless, the consequences remained severe. Entire harvests could be lost, and the fear of invisible toxins loomed over the populace. When the daily bread, which was supposed to satisfy hunger and provide strength, suddenly transformed into a source of hellish torment, trust in the mundane was profoundly shaken. For many, it served as a dire warning. Even the most essential food could be deadly. In addition to ergot, other dangers lurked within the daily intoxication. Beer and wine, which were deemed safer than water, could also prove harmful when consumed in large quantities. Excessive drinking was not uncommon. Chronicles recount tales of farmers who became so inebriated at festivals that they were incapacitated for days, unable to work. Some met their demise due to liver diseases or heart failure, long before the understanding emerged that alcohol could damage vital organs. For contemporaries, the prevailing explanation was that God punished sinful behavior. While alcohol was woven into the fabric of daily life, those who overindulged became cautionary tales for the community. Even the mysterious salves and potions posed risks. Preparations made from belladonna, henbane, or mandrake could provide pain relief in small doses. However, in larger quantities, they could lead to loss of consciousness, difficulty breathing, or even cardiac arrest. Those unfamiliar with the proper concentrations or who measured inaccurately risked their lives. Salves applied to the skin could induce hallucinations. Yet, when the dosage exceeded safe limits, the journey through dreamlike realms would culminate in feverish convulsions. Some accounts of witches' flights can be interpreted through this lens. Individuals experienced visions beyond their control, which, for the community, appeared as a pact with dark forces. The reality behind these experiences, however, was often far more straightforward. The line between a beneficial effect and a lethal poison was exceedingly thin. Imagine a midwife preparing an ointment for pain relief. The night is dark, and she accidentally adds a trace too much of an herb. Instead of healing, the woman suffers an agony. To us, this may seem like an overdose, but to a contemporary observer, it could have been seen as evidence of witchcraft at play. This illustrates how inextricably medical risks were intertwined with notions of superstition. In urban areas, people sought other forms of intoxication, experimenting with stronger wines or exotic mixtures brought in by merchants. However, unreliable recipes often led to contamination. At times, beverages were stored in lead containers, causing toxins to leach into the liquid, thus endangering health. Those who raised a glass were often unaware of the creeping death that lurked within. The dangers were not confined to rare plants, they existed in all commonplace substances. Even medications prescribed by physicians could pose significant risks. A single drop of laudanum could relieve pain, yet 5 drops could lead to respiratory failure. Given the imprecision of measurement methods, the path to disaster was much closer than people realized. All of this demonstrated how fragile the boundary was between vision and madness. A dancer in the village could just as easily be a poisoned victim as a visionary. A sick woman nursing her child could find relief from a salve or conversely succumb to death from the very same remedy. The same substance could bring both sleep and death, comfort and terror. The medieval individual navigated this precarious path daily. They needed to drink, eat, and heal, even as they scarcely understood the dangers involved. For them, every choice lay between healing and peril. And because this uncertainty cast a shadow over everyday life, intoxication became a mirror of their time, a reflection that encompassed hope, fear, and faith alike. The medieval experience of intoxication illustrates how contradictory the same substance could be. A drink could alleviate suffering, foster community, or open the door to visions. Yet, at the very same moment, it could harbor illness, debauchery, or suspicions of devilry. Thus, everyday life and danger were inextricably linked. Community, religion, and medicine intertwined in complex ways. No aspect of life was free from the influence of intoxication, and ultimately, it was the dose that determined fate. Whether it was a gift or poison, a sacred experience or damnation, remained uncertain. Perhaps you carry this ambivalence in your mind, both divine and diabolical at once, perhaps both.